Good afternoon and welcome to the Environmental Law Institute. You have joined us for Environmental Justice. My name is Caitlin McCarthy and I'm the Director of Education, Associates, and Corporate Partnerships here at ELI. We're delighted to welcome everyone to ELI's annual summer school series. Today marks the very final summer school session of the year and we're so grateful for everyone's participation today and for the last 7 weeks. We have a few more programs scheduled this summer, and we will then be reconvening in September for a great slate of programs, and I do hope you will be able to join us. For more information, please see the events page of our website, eli.org. At the end of today's panel, we will have time for a question and answer session. Please submit your questions using GoTo's question box, and please do not wait until the end. Send your questions as soon as you think of them. I would also like to thank our outstanding panelists for joining us today to lend their leadership to summer school. While I will introduce them briefly momentarily, the full speaker bios are posted on our website, eli.org, and I would encourage you to check out their expertise and experience in more detail there. As we begin, I would like to briefly introduce our panelists. Veronica Eady is the Assistant Executive Officer for Environmental Justice of the California Air Resources Board. In her role, Veronica serves as the primary internal and external contact for the California Air Resources Board on environmental justice issues and concerns, and she is responsible for providing policy consultation and recommendations. Veronica also participates in decision-making during the development and implementation of all major California Air Resources Board programs to ensure that environmental justice and tribal concerns are considered. Veronica, welcome. We're so glad to have you here. Quentin is an adjunct professor at the Howard University School of Law. He was formerly a trial attorney in the Environmental Enforcement Section of the Environment and Natural Resources Division of the Department of Justice, where he was appointed special prosecutor by the Assistant Attorney General for the Environment Division in cases referred for criminal violations of federal environmental statutes. Quentin was the Environmental Justice Coordinator representing the department on the Federal Interagency Working Group on Environmental Justice, served as the chairman for IWG's Native American Native Task Force, served as senior attorney advisor to the Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Environmental Justice, is the founding chair for the DOJ Association of Black Attorneys, and serves currently as co-chair of the American Bar Association's Committee on Diversity and Environmental Justice. Quentin, we're thrilled to have you joining us. Lavinia Reynolds is concluding, I think today is her very last day as the Policy Analyst and Environmental Justice Coordinator here at the Environmental Law Institute. A leader and convener in the environmental justice space, Lavinia has led all of ELI's environmental justice work and focused specifically on how environmental decision-making can redress environmental injustice and promote environmental equity. Formerly, Lavinia was a research associate at ELI, where her work focused on incorporating social impacts into fishery decision-making and understanding sustainability decision-making at wastewater utilities. Lavinia, we will miss you very much when you're in grad school, and thank you for lending your expertise to summer school. Robin Rotman is an assistant professor of energy and environmental law and policy in the School of Natural Resources at the University of Missouri-Columbia, and also counsel at Van Ness Feldman. Robin is an attorney focusing on energy, environmental, and natural resource issues. She previously served as Assistant General Counsel of the Missouri Department of Natural Resources and also previously taught environmental law at Georgetown as an adjunct professor. Robin has a passion for outreach, research, and teaching, especially in environmental law, policy, and justice. Robin, we're delighted to have you lending your expertise today. And Dr. Carlton Waterhouse is a professor of law at Howard University School of Law. He is an international expert on environmental law and environmental justice, as well as reparations and redress for historic injustices. Carlton has testified on the importance of reparations for African Americans before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights of the Organization of American States. He is a Fulbright Research Scholar and has focused his recent scholarship on exploring the historic and contemporary role of the United States Supreme Court in maintaining racial hierarchy, as well as research and writing on the ethical and legal dimensions of environmental justice and reparations. Carlton, we're so glad to have you back as summer school faculty. With that, I will turn things over to Quentin to get us started.
Well, thank you, Caitlin, and thank you, ELI, for inviting me to participate on this panel. You will see that I am probably the only one who does not have any slides available. I'm still living in the last century, but I'll catch up eventually. But most of what I'm going to be talking about, you can find easily on the internet. And there's plenty of information on environmental justice, but you need to have take those readings and to actually hear and listen to and be involved with people like those on the panel to really get able to understand environmental justice. Environmental justice is not something you just read about and learn. You've really got to be involved with the communities and the subject. I want to start by actually just giving the definition which I'm going to use, which is generally used for what the definition of environmental justice is. And that is, the environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, natural origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulation, and policies. You will find different people or authors that may subscribe to variations on this. This is basically the one that was used or still is used by the federal government and many state governments, most state governments. It's basically, environmental justice is a lens through which we must judge the history and future of the nation. If we are to achieve the goals of clean air, clean water, good health for all citizens. This means we must uproot racism culturally and economically from all public and private endeavors. We must ensure the fair treatment and the opportunities for meaningful involvement of citizens from low-income grassroots communities in decisions affecting the health and welfare of their respective communities, with the focus on the disproportionate negative impacts on the most vulnerable children. We must learn to hear and respect the voice of these historically underserved and underrepresented communities, particularly that of the communities of color. The history of environmental justice, basically, for me, actually goes back before the founding of the country. And when I talk about environmental justice, I refer to environmental justice as it has developed in the United States. There is an international aspect to environmental justice, which Carlton in particular would be have an expertise in, but I confine my remarks basically to the development of environmental justice in the United States. But when good old Christopher Columbus came, that's when I marked the beginnings, even though we didn't have a name for it. When the early visitors to the shore from Europe came, it immediately came to pass that the native populations were exploited, enslaved, and the wealth of the new continent was taken back to Europe. And this exploitation continued all the way into the development of the American colonies, the English colonies, and is part of the history of the United States. And then we find that environmental justice and history of slavery are intertwined. It is the sin of slavery which has permeated our culture, our history, and is one of the primary roots of environmental injustices in this country. I'll just jump forward to the what I call the precursors to modern era of environmental justice in this country, and that is World War II. After World War II, the United States was the last nation standing, so to speak. with our manufacturing facilities left intact, and we were supplying the material goods to most of the Western world. And most of those facilities and assets lie in the north. Even though the federal government instituted programs to develop the South economically after World War II, the southern states reached out to industry in the north to get them to come down to the South. They offered them cheap land, cheap labor, low taxes, and little state involvement in how these facilities would operate. And they did. They responded. There was a big influx into the South of the industry from the North. So here you are in the South, and if you were manufacturing, if you had a product that you produced, you still had waste from that production system. So what did you do with that waste? Well, you went out into the back 40, so to speak, dug a hole in the ground, dumped all of your waste into the hole, covered it up, patted down, and voila, you no longer had a waste problem. Well, it was in the 60s, I would say, late 50s, early 60s, that scientists particularly started becoming very concerned with how the United States was poisoning itself. So with all of these toxic substances, particularly in agriculture. And you had people like Rachel Carson, who was an author who did one of the defining works of environmental pollution, if you will, based on her studies of insecticides and agriculture, which at first was poo-pooed by the establishment. But more and more scientists became involved with the study of these pollutions, and which wound up at the federal level, particularly with all of these clean statutes. You had the Clean Air Statute that was passed. You had the Clean Water Act, which was passed. You had CERCLA, or what is known commonly as Superfund. All of these, and RCRA, more importantly, which were aimed at minimizing or controlling the hazardous waste that was being spun off from these industries. And as a result, that made a real pinch, if you will, on industries, and their cost went up because they had to be accountable for these waste from their products. They had these wonderful products they produced, but the cost for the waste was not included in their manufacturing costs. One of those places was in Warren County, North Carolina, which became a flashpoint, and for me and many others, the start of the environmental justice history, modern era, if you will. And the legislature in North Carolina, we had been invited these companies in, and these companies now had a problem. And they went to the legislature and said, hey, you invited us to come down here, and now I got this problem with all this waste, and I've got these big barrels of waste sitting in my parking lot. I can't park my Cadillac there. I don't know what to do with this stuff. And the legislature in North Carolina said, don't worry, we're taking care of it. We're going to build you a big super waste facility out in the middle of nowhere, won't bother anybody. This super waste facility was a big hole in the ground, no linings, no particular precautions, and was placed way out in a county called Warren County, which apparently people forgot people actually lived there. And the people that lived there, they really didn't have anybody that they recognized in the legislature. A predominantly African American community and the lowest income um, in the state. And they hadn't heard anything about, nobody came to them and talked to them about this facility, quote unquote. But the state went forward with its plans to build this super facility. So jumping forward to, there were a lot of protests and a lot of people disagreed with it, but the state went forward with this at any event. And on the day of the opening of this site, 500 trucks of PCB contaminated soil was being delivered to the site. PCBs, of course, being one of the most dangerous substances created by man. It used to be in these big containers sitting up on telephone poles. It was used to cool down electrical components, but became disfavored once PCBs were connected with carcinogenic properties. But anyway, these trucks in particular found their way to the site. And lo and behold, there were all these people who were protesting. 500 people were arrested at the opening of this facility. Many put in jail because they did not want this facility in their community. One of the people that happened to be arrested was Congressman from Washington, D.C., the Reverend Fauntleroy, who was a very prominent black minister. And as I said, he was in the House of Representatives. Not that he had a vote, but don't start me on that. That's another discussion. But he still had the right, while he was in Congress as a congressman, to ask the Government Accounting Office to do a project that he envisioned. He wanted them to take a look at the siting of the facilities like this in Warren County throughout the South, and the study should include what was the relationship between the siting and the demographics of the particular location. In doing so, it was the Government Accounting Office responded to the Congressman's request, and so issued their report in 1982. That the report found that now this is what the states in the southeast United States, 8 of them. It was interesting because the report found that 3 out of 4 of the facilities studied in these states, 3 out of 4, these were located in communities where they were located in communities where the most prominent determinant factor of where you would find these facilities was race. A distant second was income. And this, of course, just raised a big hullabaloo in academia because, you're trying to say by the emphasizing race being the determinant factor that we don't discriminate in this country like that in these waste disposal sites. But in 1987, very prominent researchers, 2 of them, Charles Lee and Vernice Miller Travis, decided to take the study of the GAO and nationwide to all 50 states. And this was under the auspices of the United Church of Christ, and they were commissioned to do this study. And they did. The results of that study: 3 out of 4 of these facilities were found in communities of color and low-income communities, and that the most distinguishing feature was race. Again, income was a distant second. Well, this really stirred the pot in academia, but at the chair of the commission for the church on racial equality was Reverend Ben Chavis. And looking at the results, he coined the term environmental racism because of the strong relationship between siting and the demographics. By the time we got to the national studies, we referred to populations of people of color, where before, when it was just in the southeast where most black folks lived, it was a black population. I'd like to jump forward to 2007, when a very distinguished scholar, environmental justice scholar, Bob Bullitt killed me. Bob Bullitt, and they put together a team of other distinguished scholars who said, you know, it's 20 years later since that very significant report by the United Church of Christ. Let's go back and look at that report and see where we are 20 years later. We've got more sophisticated protocols and methodologies. We've got these great computers, plus we got some money. And let's take a look at this. Again, 20 years later, the results were not only the same, they were worse. And the predominant feature of determining where you would find these sites was race. Income, again, being a very distant second. So these are three documents in particular, things that I use in teaching the course of environmental justice at the Howard Law. And it's kind of the basic documents in academia, which in my opinion have not been either overturned or found to be wanting. There have been discussions and criticisms around the edges, whether you use certain methodologies of using zip codes versus political boundaries or markers and other methodologies, but the basic conclusions of this report have stood the test of time to today. How is it today, 2020, these results stand? I'd like to bring your attention to one other document, and that is the 1992 report of the journal. What's the name of the journal? The National Law Journal. They commissioned a study looking at enforcement of environmental laws and using as their focus the database of EPA, the Superfund database. How were these laws and cleanups of the abandoned waste sites? How were they conducted? And the interesting results there were the fact that in communities of color, cleanup, not so much. White affluent communities, much better. And in terms of penalties, in the white affluent communities, nominal penalties. In communities of color, excuse me, in the communities of color, there were nominal penalties of the polluters, and in the white affluent communities, they were very substantial penalties. So these four documents, to me, are kind of the essence of which I used in teaching my students. You know, here the documentation that establishes this, and it's yet to be refuted. I would like to give a special attention to Bob Bullard's great book. I think came out about the same time in 1990, 92, Dumping in Dixie, which is an excellent introduction to the general public on how these communities, underserved communities, communities of color, have endured these toxic substances and facilities being placed in their communities, the disparate health impacts. And subsequent to that, there were many, many other books and articles on environmental justice and the disparate impact of health that can be readily found by just looking online for the average person who just wants to acquaint themselves and to educate themselves on environmental justice. And I leave it to you, those who are much better at I on the internet, to find them. I think you'll find them. It's quite profitable. It took EPA a little while to get around to it, but they finally they had in, I think it was 1990, EPA forms an environmental equity work group to study the question of waste in America and the demographics of the issue. In 1992, the EPA created the Office of Environmental Justice, it was formerly the Office of Environmental Equity. This is where there's a transition in the lexicon, so to speak, from environmental racism into environmental justice and environmental equity, because, quite frankly, it's a little bit more polite to talk about injustice than racism. But at the bottom of the barrel, it's still environmental racism, because race has always been the connecting link between these facilities, to disposal, whether inadvertent or purposeful. The wasn't until 1994, with the publication of President Clinton's Executive Order 12898 on environmental justice, which finally brought the government, federal government, into actually addressing these issues and giving folks like myself, who were in government at the time, a vehicle or a handle on addressing these problems. I think of it as a major accomplishment. Now, people will tell you that, oh, it is just an environmental, it's just an executive order. And what does that mean? In an executive order, it was just that. It directed the executive branch of the federal government to do what the president said. This was the boss telling you, I want you to direct your efforts and your missions to include environmental justice into the mission statement of everything you do, and to correct these injustices, quite frankly. Now, admittedly, this is not a law. There is no environmental justice law. And I'm always a little suspicious about laws and regulations and rules anyway, because they're only as good as the people enforcing them, which is particularly my interest in the National Law Journal article. Enforcement is a real important aspect of how we implement our environmental laws. And when it comes to these communities, we're found wanting. But the Executive Order 12898 gave us something that we could use. I remember I have discussions with various people. We had a discussion with mid-level bureaucrat in energy who we had a project we wanted to develop. He said, "Oh, this is a Clinton thing. We're not interested. This was in the Bush administration." I said, have you looked at the Executive Order 12898? That's a letter from your boss. And that is still extant. It didn't die with the change of administrations. I would also point out to folks that it has survived 6, or is it 7, administrations, and it still exists today. And what's important is how that you've been used as leverage. If you have people and programs in the federal government that want to address this problem, it's a very effective tool. Not so much with the change of administrations, then you got a problem. But it still exists today and is an important tool.
Thank you so much, Quentin. I think we need to jump ahead to Robin here.
Timing is everything, as it was said. Robin Rotman has covered a lot of more than the things I wanted to say, but plus she's got slides, which will be very helpful to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. I have to say, it is just really a privilege to speak on a panel with people who've been working on this issue since before I was born and throughout their career. So a lot of this learning I've gotten secondhand, and it's amazing to hear from the people who are really involved all the way from the start. Quentin did a better job than I could at covering that background, so I'm just going to skip over all of it, and I'm going to spend all my time on just 3 current issues. So we're going to just flip through. Let's see here. Let's see, Caitlin, thank you. Let me take a minute to stop here. Caitlin, you might have to control the slides. I thought as like a more junior person on the panel, I might just talk a little bit more about how I learned about environmental justice and how I became interested in it. Because I know we have maybe some law students or junior attorneys who are participating today. My undergrad degree is in geology, and I guess my first exposure to environmental justice issues, I didn't know that term at the time, but the summer after my freshman year of college, I worked for the EPA on a small Indian reservation called the South Fork Reservation in northeastern Nevada. And there I was helping the tribe to set up a water quality monitoring program related to acid mine drainage. So from some abandoned lead and silver mining sites upstream from the reservation that hadn't been properly remediated. So that really got me thinking about, I always thought I was going to have more of like a natural science kind of background or career, but thinking about the impacts of environmental quality problems on people. I did a master's at Oxford in water science. So again, continuing to look at that kind of human and environmental interface. And then decided that instead of going the natural science route, I was going to go to law school and to try to focus more on the legal and the regulatory aspects of environmental problems. When I was at Yale, I had a chance to participate and then to be the student leader of the Environmental Law and Policy Clinic. And for those who are still in law school, I would really encourage you to take advantage of clinical opportunities like this if they come your way. So this is actually like an interdisciplinary clinic. So we had students from the forestry school, the law school, and as well as public health and engineering to look holistically on environmental issues. And my 2L year, some of these projects were international, some were national, but I really wanted to do something actually in New Haven. I felt like I was, living in the city of New Haven, but my whole life was just the law school and the law library, and wanted to learn a little bit more about what was actually happening in town. So I got connected with the New Haven Environmental Justice Network. And this was a citizens group that was fighting the expansion of a sewage sludge incinerator. So when there's a wastewater treatment plant, there's sludge, the solids. These are dried, and one way to dispose of the dried solids is to incinerate them. And the issue was that these sewage sludge solids were coming in really from New York, from all over New England, to be incinerated in New Haven. So this is really what got me going down the road of environmental justice. I've been practicing for about 10 years, and it's been a theme throughout my practice. In terms of my professional background, well, I'm from Chicago, and when I was graduating law school, I wanted to come back to the Midwest. And I had an opportunity to come here to Missouri, to Jeff City, Missouri, to work for the state environmental regulator, which here is the Missouri Department of Natural Resources. And one thing that I had the opportunity to do was to start we called it the Missouri Environmental Justice Working Group. And this is, was very much in the fledgling stages, but just bringing different state employees together, both from DNR and from other relevant departments, to begin talking about environmental justice issues. And Quentin mentioned the topic of enforcement, and that was something very much that that we focused in on. With there are limited resources, you have to prioritize inspections and enforcement, and how to do that in the communities that are most vulnerable. So I was at DNR for 2 years. Then I went to DC to work in private practice for 7 years at the firm Van Ness Feldman, where I maintain a consulting relationship. VNF has about 120 attorneys focusing on energy, environmental, and natural resources law. And at VNF, my practice focuses in particular on Native American issues, and I'll talk about that today. While I was at VNF, I had the opportunity to teach for 2 years at Georgetown, not in the law school, but in the School of Foreign Service, teaching environmental law to undergrad students, and just really found my passion in teaching and decided to make the move into academia. So I think Caitlin will be able to advance to the next slide, but I'll go ahead and continue and say that, so I came to Mizzou 2 years ago. I teach undergrad and graduate students in the area of environmental law and environmental justice, land use, water resources, and natural resource policy. I also wanted to put in a plug for an organization that I'm involved in, and this has chapters throughout the country. It's called Manners, Minorities in Agriculture, Natural Resources, and Related Sciences. So I'm one of several faculty advisors. This is open to all students, and it's really a professional development organization for people interested in going into this field. So that's enough about me. We're gonna go, I'm gonna skip over all this. All I'm gonna do is show a couple pictures. Quentin already provided the US EPA definition. A few other points in the timeline. I'll leave these slides for your reference, but I won't go through these. Really just showing the interconnection between the civil rights movement and environmental justice. Here's a couple pictures from the Warren County protests that Quentin already discussed. You can see the arrest, the role of the clergy, the protests against the PCB landfill, the GAO study. I might take a pause and just mention this one event that happened in 1991, which was the National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. And so I was born in '82, so I guess for most of the time that I've been aware, the issue of environmental justice, it has been one that's been championed by Sierra Club or Environmental Defense or NRDC, but that wasn't always the case. And so it was really only in the past 20 or 30 years that the environmental justice movement seems to have become part of what we would consider like the mainstream environmental movement, which really is not that long if you think about it. The current document is the EJ 2020 Action Agenda. I've stated the mission statement here. So this was produced by EPA with the goal being that by 2020, the EPA wanted to integrate environmental justice into everything it does. So you can see rulemaking, permitting, enforcement, and we can discuss, to what extent these goals have been achieved. But let me take my time. I've just got 3 slides on 3 current topics that might be of interest to you. Like I said, at VNF, a lot of my practice has been working with Native American communities. And when I think about environmental justice in Native American communities, I really see it as a matter of sovereignty and a matter of self-determination. A few points to raise. For example, with the Dakota Access Pipeline, I think there's been a lot of awareness recently about siting decisions. So deciding to site an infrastructure project or a waste facility on tribal lands, and the importance of meaningful consultation in that process. I would point out that the BIA, so the Bureau of Indian Affairs, who serves as a trustee for the Indian tribes, whether they should or they shouldn't, that's the structure that there is. And this means they have a fiduciary duty to advocate for the tribe's best interests when the federal government is involved. And I think in some cases, the BIA has done a great job of that. And perhaps in other instances, the BIA just kind of goes along with what the other federal agencies want without really serving as a meaningful advocate for the tribe. An issue that's come up, so I haven't been involved in many of these siting cases in my practice. What I've done more of is working with tribes who want to develop natural resources as a matter of economic self-sufficiency. So I've included a photo here from one of our clients, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, who own and operate a hydropower project on the Flathead River on their reservation in Montana. And the sale of clean energy has been a great source of revenue to the tribe and of professional jobs. So I bring this up to say this, which is that part of environmental justice, I believe, is being able to do what you want with your resources. And while tribes should be, should not be subject to outside influences that are bringing pollution or bringing projects that are not wanted, I think that they should also have the right to choose, whether that's through mining or through forestry or through energy generation, to make the decisions with their resources that are best for their community, because that's really at the core of like what sovereignty is. I think that this really brings up some interesting climate justice issues, which now we're kind of going into the international. We have clients who are in the Gulf Coast of Louisiana. They're tribal lands that are subject to flooding and potential relocation of whole communities. We also do a lot of work on the North Slope in Alaska. So for Alaska Native corporations who are actively supporting oil and gas extraction, and that is a major source of revenue in their communities. And I think that they're well aware that there's of course an irony, which is this resource through which they're able to get great economic gain is also causing climate change. I would say to some tribes, they might take the position that, well, at the end of the day, there's always going to be oil and gas development, and why not use that as a way to improve the tribe, improve the infrastructure, improve the resources, as opposed to kind of sitting this one out and they're just facing the consequences of it. Going on to NEPA, it's a big day on NEPA because CEQ just released revised regulations regarding NEPA implementation, probably the biggest revision since NEPA's creation. But before that, I would say that EPA has produced 2 useful documents about addressing environmental justice in NEPA reviews, and I've included images of those here. So that guidance recommends, I mean, there's nothing earth-shattering here, but just the need to identify vulnerable populations, engage individuals throughout the NEPA process, analyze impacts, especially disproportionately high and adverse impacts on certain populations, and seek public comment. I would say in short that I haven't read them cover to cover, the new CEQ rules, but the premise is to streamline the NEPA process, to make it move faster, to not have, projects seemingly like bogged down in public participation. And so I'll just make the point that, the idea of less public participation means that there will be less public participation, including from among these groups for who've been identified as vulnerable and who the EPA is recommending increased efforts to promote public participation. So I think in this kind of new era of NEPA implementation, this will be an important space to watch. One more slide. COVID, I mean, it's on everyone's mind these days. And so I've been thinking about kind of how that has affected my views on environmental justice, or just kind of the things that I've been grateful for during this difficult time. So clearly, we're spending a lot more time indoors. And a lot of the environmental justice issues we've discussed today, or that I teach in my class, are kind of in the ambient environment. So air quality, surface water quality. But it's important to remember that people actually spend the overwhelming majority of their time inside, whether that be in their home or in their workplace. And so issues such as mold or lead paint, or even say secondhand smoke, these have flown below the radar a little bit because it's harder to assert like a federal hook, say over mold. But these really do have a significant impact on human health. And I think maybe as we said, environmental racism, that really shed a light on what was happening in Flint with drinking water, but that might also be an area that was previously overlooked. So that's, as I kind of gear up for the next semester, and I'm thinking, how do I want to kind of modify my curriculum to not obsess about COVID, but to recognize what we're learning from it. For me, one takeaway is really the importance of indoor environmental quality. As well, so we're all spending more time indoors, but we're certainly being encouraged to spend some time outdoors. And if you want to come back to that slide. So not everyone has the same outdoor resources. So I'm living here in Columbia, Missouri, which is a fairly rural setting, and it's easy for anyone in the community to get out and about. But that's not the case everywhere, whether that be because there isn't green space or whether there's a fee for using different resources. So that's another aspect that I think COVID has shed a light on. One thing we've done here in Missouri, for example, is to waive the fees for fishing and hunting licenses. So you see a lot of people out and about fishing, at least trying to make these resources available in this time. I'll end just by leaving you this slide on a couple EPA resources. If you're not familiar, I'd encourage you to check out this EJ Screen tool. So this is like a GIS tool that's free to use on the EPA website, where there's different layers. So you can layer demographics as well as environmental quality in order to help identify vulnerable communities. I've also included some links to different funding opportunities. The small grants and the collaboration agreements are ongoing funding opportunities. Right now, there's one out from EPA specifically targeting COVID. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you.
Hi. I think I'm next. Let me see if I have control of my screen. Okay, great. So hi, my name is Lavinia Reynolds. I am the now former Environmental Justice Coordinator at the Environmental Law Institute. I wanted to say thank you so much to Caitlin for the invitation to speak on this panel. It's an honor to be surrounded by such experts in this field. But today I wanted to talk a little bit about climate justice and how we build just societies in the middle of a climate crisis, and some examples of policies and policy platforms that are already working to do so. Oh, okay. Okay, sorry. All right, so a little bit about me. So my journey to environmental justice kind of started out with traditional environmentalism. So I was really into reduce, reuse, recycle. I think I wrote and acted in some very cringy skits at my church on avoiding plastic bag use. But I didn't really see myself reflected in the environmental movement, and it felt kind of isolating. So that changed when I got to college and was able to take a class on environmental justice. I learned about the intersection of environment and racial justice, and it really felt like home for me. I've been able to explore environmental justice in its very many different permutations in cities like Detroit, Miami, Rio, and Providence, and that's kind of really helped how I think about what environmental justice and climate justice should look like. Now, what I'm kind of thinking about, especially in this current period of time, I'm trying to think about what does Black liberation look like? And as Mustafa Ali says, how can we get communities from just surviving to thriving, especially as it relates to the environment. So with that, I will jump in. So as I mentioned, sorry, I'm a little confused with these slides. Oh, Carlton, I think you have control at the moment. Okay. Here we go. All right. Thank you for your patience. We're living in a crazy time. We're dealing both with a global pandemic as well as a racial injustice reckoning. And I think, you know, it's both scary, but also has been really inspiring to see the amount of momentum dedicated towards addressing racial injustice in the midst of a global health, like systemic health failure. So I think one of the things that we're seeing is that crises really do affect us differently, and we see that unfortunately in DC, where Black people and African Americans are disproportionately dying of COVID-19, and we now know that racial injustice is deadly. And kind of armed with this knowledge, we are starting to build a new normal for ourselves. So I've seen a lot of local activism here in DC. I've seen mutual aid groups like sprouting up and creating communities of care. And it's been kind of a model for how we're going to be dealing with the climate crisis moving forward. Okay. So what is climate justice? Climate justice addresses the idea that climate change impacts Black, Brown, Indigenous, and poor communities first and worst. And we see this almost everywhere, I think, with some of the hurricanes we've seen, fires, heat waves, flooding. Black, Brown, Indigenous, and poor communities bear the brunt of these impacts, and that happens both on an international scale as well as a domestic scale. And I should note that climate justice is a part of the environmental justice movement, and that it builds on the decades of activism and work of environmental justice advocates. And I think it's really important that when we are doing climate justice work, that we take into consideration all of the work that's been done as it relates to environmental justice in the past and present. Okay, one moment. All right, so what is a just transition? A just transition is a way that we addressed both racial injustice, systemic injustice, as well as climate change. So traditionally, I think a just transition has referred to a shift from a fossil fuel dependent energy system to a renewable energy system. But I kind of want to expand that and push that a little bit to think about just transition as a way we move from an extractive economy to building an economy that works for us. So some of the things that we think about when we say just transition is a shift of economic control to communities, democratization of wealth, ecological restoration, driving racial justice and social justice, supporting local economies, and respecting and restoring cultures and traditions. Those are kind of the values that we use to help filter this transition from an extractive economy to a regenerative one. Okay. And I think this graphic, this is from the Climate Justice Alliance, as is the definition on the previous slide, but this graphic really nicely lays out what that transition could look like. So we are currently operating, sorry.
Living, if you use your arrow keys instead of the mouse, you'll be able to go back and forth easier.
Perfect, thank you, Caitlin. Okay. So we are operating in what we would call an extractive economy. So we extract resources, labor, and we want to move towards a regenerative economy. So I'm using policy on an international, national, and local scale. We want to build a system that invests in building communities of care, healthy communities, healthy environments, as well as a renewable energy economy. Okay, so how do we do that? Climate justice and environmental justice requires leadership from marginalized voices, as well as direct investment in marginalized communities and leaders. And this kind of plays into procedural and distributional justice, or distributive justice. So when we talk about environmental justice, we talk about how do we change processes and procedures to be more just and equitable. And we also talk about how can we change the distribution of impacts, or such as harms and benefits, to be more just and equitable. So the process we want to change is we don't just want to include marginalized voices in decision making around the environment, we want their leadership. And we don't just want to make sure that we are shielding marginalized communities from harm, we want to directly invest in providing benefits to marginalized communities. All right, so I wanted to talk about some examples of leadership from marginalized communities. Over the past year, there have been at least 3 policy platforms developed by grassroots environmental justice groups that kind of help to lay out what a just transition could look like. The first is the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform, which is a federal policy platform that focuses on issues like air pollution, just transportation systems, and community self-determination. There are currently 283 signatories to this policy platform, and it's actually was developed in partnership between grassroots organizations and what we call the big green, so like NRDC. The next is the 100% Network's Regenerative and Just 100% Policy Building Blocks. This platform was developed through a coalition of 75 local, regional, and national environmental organizations, including the NAACP, Emerald Cities Collaborative, and Opal Oregon. So this policy platform describes a vision for what a just transition can look like, both in terms of renewable energy goals, fuel switching, as well as broader areas such as housing, transportation, governance, and worker protections. The last example, and this one was most recently published in June this year, is the National Economic Transition, published through the Just Transition Fund. This was a coalition of 81 tribal groups and labor unions that are located in communities that will be impacted by the transition away from coal. And it focuses on federal investment in coal-dependent communities and asks that federal policies direct money directly to local communities. And it focuses on areas like health, workforce training and workforce development, provision of healthy communities, so ecological restoration, as a way of developing jobs. It has a number of other tenets that I think are really interesting and reflect the needs and priorities of these communities. Next, I wanted to talk about 2 examples, excuse me one second, of policies that directly invest in marginalized communities. The first is the New York Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which was passed in 2019. It was developed and advocated for by New York Renews, which is a coalition of over 200 environmental justice and labor and community groups. This policy directs 40% of the benefits associated with a transition to renewable energy directly towards environmental justice communities. It also develops a community air monitoring program and prioritizes greenhouse gas emissions and pollution reductions in environmental justice communities. I want to just reiterate that this policy was the direct result of activism on behalf of these grassroots groups. And I think it's just really inspiring to see that this is one of the leading climate policies and was the work of activists on the ground. The second is the Illinois Future Energy Jobs Act, which was passed in 2016. This was proposed and advocated for by the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition. This policy directs $750 million to low-income communities through workforce development, customer savings programs. And it also creates the Solar for All program, which expands access to community solar throughout Illinois. 25% of the incentives associated with the Solar for All program must go towards environmental justice communities. As a next step, the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition is hoping to pass the Clean Energy Jobs Act, which will expand some of the programs under the Future Energy Jobs Act. Okay, So as I mentioned, environmental and climate justice requires leadership from marginalized voices and investment in marginalized communities and leaders. Again, we want to kind of shift the narrative from inclusion to leadership, and also directly providing benefits to marginalized leaders. And I think this kind of has a reparations lens to it as well. I guess if there's anything that you will take away from this, I'm hoping that it's these 2 points. And lastly, kind of wanted to provide some what you can do's, because I think it's always really important that each of us as individuals works to advance climate justice and environmental justice in our own capacity. So here are some links to some ELI resources. The first is Community Lawyering for Environmental and Climate Justice. And I know Professor Waterhouse is going to talk a little bit about community lawyering, I think, later. But this program was held on April 17th and features some really incredible environmental justice lawyers talking about what community lawyering can look like. And there's a link to the event on ELI's webpage. State Approaches to a Just Transition was on July 10th and features panelists from New York, Massachusetts, and DC discussing these different policies, including the New York Climate Leadership and Community Protections Act that I just mentioned. We also put together an environmental justice reading list if you have some time and want to learn more about environmental justice. We're also happy to take recommendations to add to the reading list. And then I also included the links to the 3 policy platforms that I mentioned. And I think it's important to kind of get to know these policy platforms and listen to them and view them and as they are like the priorities and needs of frontline communities. And then lastly, I think working towards undoing systemic injustice is a lot of work and can seem overwhelming, but everyday small actions I think can help. So how have you supported marginalized communities today? What have you read? Who have you donated to? And what resources have you shared that helped to shift your perspective on the world as you see it today? And I think that is it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Veronica Eady. I'm with the California Air Resources Board. For those of you not familiar with the Air Resources Board, we're the statewide agency in California that regulates air quality and climate change. California is a little bit unique because while CARB is our statewide agency, we are split up into 35 air districts that are basically airsheds across the state that regulate stationary sources. At CARB, we regulate mobile sources. We are responsible for vehicle certification. If you've seen the check engine light on your car, that's us. You're welcome. We're also the agency that discovered the Volkswagen diesel cheat device a few years ago. So we employ scientists and engineers from around the world who are doing really great work. We regulate anything with an engine, so not just cars and trucks. We regulate leaf blowers, we regulate jet skis, you name it. We're testing them in our labs. And we also regulate consumer products like air fresheners, your Febreze and things like that that emit volatile organic compounds. I'm going to focus today a little bit on our climate programs, which is going to take us into neighborhood scale pollution and what we're doing to address pollution issues on the ground. So my title of my presentation is about democracy and air quality management. And I'll explain a few as we go forward. This photograph is former Governor Jerry Brown, who is signing a bill called Assembly Bill 617, and that's what most of my presentation is gonna be about. So in an environmental justice context where my job is concerned, all things start with the Global Warming Solutions Act in California, also known as AB 32. When I moved out to California 4 years ago to go to work for the Air Resources Board, I started by looking at the websites of a lot of the EJ groups in California to get a handle on what the most important issues were to communities across the state. And the biggest issue was by far, at least with respect to air quality, California's cap and trade program. So in 2006, Governor Schwarzenegger signed AB 32, as I said, also known as the California Global Warming Solutions Act. And with AB 32, there were a number of goals set for greenhouse gas reduction. We were to return to 1990 levels by 2020, which we achieved in 2016. And we're now moving on to our 2030 goals. AB 32 led to CARB creating a suite of programs. By far, our most important or most famous program is cap and trade, but it also includes our low carbon fuel standards, renewable portfolio standard, short-lived climate pollutant strategy for things like methane and mobile source strategy, and our advanced clean trucks. And notably, 2 weeks ago, the CARB board adopted its advanced clean trucks rule, which was the first of its sort in the nation that requires the phasing in of zero emission heavy duty trucks. So the importance of, or one of the key importance of cap and trade, and one of its vulnerabilities is that rather than reducing emissions at the source, these facilities that are covered by the cap and trade program, things like refineries, cement kilns, power plants, rather than reducing their greenhouse gases, they can buy basically a permit to emit greenhouse gases, also known as an allowance. And in theory, if they have a number of facilities in California, they can actually increase greenhouse gas emissions. They just need to have that permit or allowance. That creates a problem because many of California's most overburdened communities, communities of color and low-income communities, house these facilities, and greenhouse gases are not emitted in a vacuum. There have been some studies done that show that greenhouse gases have co-pollutants that are emitted with them. And while greenhouse gases themselves may not necessarily make you sick, these co-pollutants can, things like benzene and toxic air contaminants. So there were a couple of studies done, one most notably by CARB's sister agency, the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. And Robin mentioned EJ screen. In California, we have CalEnviroScreen, similar tool. And the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, also known as OEHA, put that tool together. You see to the right there some of the maps that are generated by CalEnviroScreen that shows where disadvantaged communities in California live. Disadvantaged communities is a term, is a legal term in Senate Bill 535. And that's where we focus a lot of our work with communities to reduce, improve air quality and reduce the environmental burden. It's also where we funnel money, particularly funding coming out of our cap and trade program. But anyway, going back to OEHA's report on greenhouse gases and co-pollutants, I've put here a couple of the conclusions. There were far more than this, but they did find a correlation between greenhouse gases, PM2.5, and other toxic air pollution emissions. This particular study focused on refineries, hydrogen plants, and cement plants. OEHA is planning to come out with more studies. This is the initial one that came out in 2017. So the lay of the land, what does it look like? Well, you see here where you see the red house, behind it is a refinery. That's a cap and trade facility. This is in Wilmington, California, in the LA area. Wilmington is also the besides having a number of refineries, not just this one, it is also the home to the port of LA, and the port of Long Beach is next door to it. And you see a photograph here of the ports. It's important to note, particularly in this COVID world, I'm not even sure where we are in the COVID world, but when things are normal, the way they were pre-COVID, 40% of the goods coming into the United States were coming through the ports of LA and Long Beach. Then put on these trucks that you see, and they were trucked out to the Inland Empire region. That's San Bernardino, Ontario, Riverside, where if you were to fly over those regions, you would see, as far as the eye could see, warehouses. That's by far, we have a lot of warehouses in California, but that is the largest concentration. So you have the port, you have the refinery, and you have these trucks going through people's neighborhoods to get to those warehouses in the Inland Empire. Over here on the left, on the top, you see a low-income housing complex in a community in the Bay Area called Rodeo. And this community is called Bayo Vista. It is a largely African-American facility or development. The little hill that you see behind it, just on the top there, you can see the tops of tank farms. These tanks below it are those very tank farms, which last summer caught fire, which you see here, putting at risk the people who live right next to them. And these people were not evacuated. They were asked to shelter in place. But it's important to remember when we're talking about these facilities, we're also talking about people's neighborhoods. Okay. So this slide, we love to show a CARB that shows how well we're doing in California, how much we've improved the air quality since the 80s. And it's true, we have done a really good job of improving air quality. Unfortunately, you see the blue line on the bottom, which is all communities in California, but the red line represents what we call disadvantaged communities or EJ communities. So we are lagging behind in our most overburdened communities, and the legislature recognized that and made it an imperative. But you see here in the bullets, these disparities persist. I mean, if you put a COVID map up there, you'd see the same thing. We've got associated health risks and a disproportionate burden. Okay, wait, somebody advanced me. I learned when Robin was giving her presentation that we all have the ability to advance each other's slides. So I think somebody advanced me. Okay. So I wanted to, I'm going to talk about AB 617. And before I get there, let me take a step back. So we have this problem where there are these facilities in people of color communities and low-income communities. Governor Brown wanted to extend the cap and trade program to 2030. That was part of the legacy that he wanted to leave. And because our cap and trade program had been legally challenged and actually taken to the California Supreme Court by the California Chamber of Commerce, claiming that the proceeds from cap and trade were actually a tax. And in California, a tax in the legislature, a tax takes a supermajority of the legislative vote. So in order to protect it, even though we had won in the California Supreme Court, Governor Brown wanted the cap and trade program to be enshrined in law. Although AB 32 required CARB to come up with a market incentive program for greenhouse gases, a market-based program, it didn't say that it had to be cap and trade. And so Governor Brown wanted to protect it and enshrine it in law. It was a very, very heated battle about actually exactly 3 years ago, summer of 2017, when people were literally sleeping on couches in the Capitol as these negotiations were happening. And what Governor Brown did to make the cap and trade bill viable was that he created AB 617. And AB 617 was intended to address that localized pollution. So if we have a refinery that's emitting more greenhouse gases and therefore more co-pollutants than it normally would if cap and trade didn't exist, what can we do in local communities to address localized pollution? Now, most of us know that, you know, our air quality regulation system isn't focused on, the state framework is not focused on localized pollution. It's regional pollution. It's through the state or the federal air quality standards. So this was a first of its kind effort to really get at what people are breathing when they're walking down the street in their communities, or when they're walking from public transportation into their offices. AB 617 captured that. So what are the elements of AB 617? First of all, it requires community scale air monitoring, and many of the monitors that are deployed in the communities are low-cost sensors, which we, you know, have the benefit of now. You can go to Amazon and buy a low-cost sensor online for $200, and that's a drop in the bucket in comparison to a regulatory monitor that can cost tens of thousands of dollars. CARB put together a statewide monitoring plan. Part of it also is creating a data display, a publicly accessible data display that shows all of the data that CARB is collecting, all of the data that the air districts are collecting, as well as the data that community air monitoring systems that are popping up around the state are collecting. This is part of the democratization, having public access to what we're breathing, and for the most part in real time, as opposed to federal standards, which might be a 24-hour standard or an 8-hour standard. This is accessible, it's immediate, and people can make a decision right away based on this data, whether or not they want to jog outside or have their children play outside in the playground. It came with a good bit of funding, which I will talk about in a later slide, and really where AB 617 all ends up is in community emission reduction plans, where strategies for reducing emissions in overburdened communities are devised, collected, shared, implemented. Some of those are, you know, changing truck routes. Some of those are entering MOUs with ports, say the Port of Oakland, around their operations. Maybe they agreed to use zero emission equipment or zero emission drayage trucks going in and out of the ports. And there is also provisions around best available control technology and accelerated schedule for best available control technology known as BACT, and BART known as best available retrofit control technology. So part of CARB's role in this is to put together a statewide strategy for how this is going to work. The implementation is going to work so that all of the districts that have these communities are all working under the same framework and the same systems. So in the first year, CARB, our other role is to select which communities are the top priority communities. So in the first year, we selected 10 communities. Last year, our board added 3 more communities. The new communities are Stockton, Southeast LA, and the Eastern Coachella Valley, but you can see that these communities are across the state. We took a variety of communities so that as we developed strategies for these communities, we would be able to export them to other similar communities. So the San Joaquin Valley, for example, in southern San Joaquin Valley, Shafter is an agricultural community. So some of our strategies are around pesticide spraying, working with our sister agency, the Department of Pesticide Regulation, notifying communities around when pesticides are being sprayed. There are even some pesticides that are being phased out as a result of AB 617. Again, working with our sister agency. The Imperial Valley there, which incidentally is a hotbed per capita for COVID-19. That's a desert community. So what can we export from this desert agricultural community that can be duplicated or replicated in other communities? So most of these communities were now into putting together the emission reduction plans, but there are, excuse me, a number of factors that went into our selecting these communities. And I'll just stop here and talk for a little bit about what that process was. Anybody could nominate their own community, a resident, an air district. We weighed whatever information that was submitted by those organizations. As I said, we used CalEnviroScreen. CalEnviroScreen is a very useful tool. One thing that I will point out, though, is that, and CalEnviroScreen uses 20 environmental exposure and social indicators. One of the problems that we ran into is we were not able to run CalEnviroScreen as a statewide model because we have portions of the state, like the Bay Area, that cost a lot more to live than other parts of the state. And so it was really difficult to compare communities statewide. We really had to do it regionally. In fact, when we ran the census tracts, the first run of census tracts under CalEnviroScreen, we didn't get any census tracts in the Bay Area until number 251, which was a census tract in Oakland. So we knew pretty quickly that we weren't going to be able to use it as a statewide. But we did break it down into regions and it worked quite well. We used facility risk assessment, density, as well as public health information to select these 13 communities. So AB 617, I have to admit, builds on some local community-based initiatives that we at CARB have learned a lot from. We actually gave a grant to an organization so that they could educate us on their air monitoring network. This is in Imperial County. You see the Mexican border there, Mexicali. Another thing that was unique about Imperial Valley is that there's a lot of cross-boundary pollution. Some of it is burning, ag burning on our side of the border, tire burning, trash burning on the Mexican side of the border, as well as idling cars at the border. On a normal day, it takes 2 to 3 hours to cross the border from Mexicali into Calexico. If it's a holiday, cars are idling for 6 hours or more. And I just heard, I was in a community meeting last week, a Zoom meeting in Imperial, and I just heard that due to COVID, things have kind of switched. And last week, there was a 6-hour wait time on the California side of the border to get into Mexico. This air monitoring system is called Ivan Air. It was created by an organization called Comité Cívico del Valle that had a grant of $2 million from NIHS to erect this. It was 40 low-cost PM sensors. We have since given them, this organization, as well as other organizations, grant money to extend this network, as well as others in the state, and I'll talk about in a minute. Their model was to put together community steering committees. The steering committees used their own community knowledge and ground truthing to decide on where these monitors should be placed. And so we've used that same system through the implementation of AB 617, bringing together multi-stakeholder steering committees to help with monitoring, as well as a number of other things that they decide on, including what strategies to include. Going on to the next slide, CARB, as a part of AB 617, is required to establish an emissions reporting portal. As I said earlier, this is all kinds of data that's coming into us. Even some facilities that are monitoring, for example, we have a law that requires refineries to do fence line monitoring. So that is also added into the portal, as well as Ivan air monitoring data, a whole host. One of the things of our challenges in California is that since we do have 35 separate air districts regulating stationary sources, there were essentially 35 different systems for collecting data, 35 different intervals at which they collected data, the kinds of data that they were collecting. And so now we are knee deep into creating this emissions statewide portal where anybody from the public can access and look at any kind of reporting data and zero in on certain parts of the region. We are very methodical in program evaluation and tracking success so that we can tweak the program and improve it. So right now we're in discussions with an advisory group that we put together to help us think about this, about how do we put together public health goals in the communities that have the 13 AB 617 communities. How do we create toxic risk reduction? What sorts of metrics make sense? And they might vary from community to community. But all of this is through a public process and public engagement. The steering committees that I mentioned meet at least once a month. Some of them have subcommittees and meet more frequently. Some of them have technical advisory committees. Funding is very important, so I'll go into that for a minute. I mentioned the cap and trade program. In a normal, so we have auctions 4 times a year, quarterly auctions, and in a normal auction, the proceeds are in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Unfortunately, due to COVID, our last auction, which was in May, only produced $25 million. There are a lot of programs that rely on those cap and trade dollars. Drinking water programs, high-speed rail, affordable housing, equity, low carbon transportation for low-income people. So and the nature of the cap and trade program itself is that the funds should be less as we lower the cap. So a lot of thought needs to be had about where do we go if cap and trade fails us. This program was prioritized in next year's budget for cap and trade dollars, so hopefully we will continue to have funding, but it's an expensive program. The first year was $27 million, and that is implementation funding just to implement the program that goes to the districts that have those programs. Last year was $50 million. We've got another $50 million this year, but the air districts are worried about resources. We're worried about resources. Community groups are worried about resources. Here's to give you another idea of the sums of money that have been put into this program. So incentive funding to phase in cleaner technologies and phase out diesel and fossil fuel technologies. So far, $740 million of cap and trade money. That's no small sum. A few of the things that the funding has gone to is zero emission school buses, ZEB infrastructure. In the last budget bill, the legislature prioritized stationary sources for the first time, and in particular hexavalent chromium, and an additional category that the community gets to decide where those incentive funds happen. Okay. Community assistance grants. This is another important piece. You see on the right here, an EJ leader in Wilmington, California. That's Jesse Marquez. I don't know if any of you know him, but he has been a fierce advocate largely around the refineries and around the ports. We were given in total $25 million, and this is my program personally, $25 million to create a grant program to go to community-based organizations and tribes to assist them in participating in the AB 617 program. A lot of that money went to public participation, supporting community meetings and things like that. But we have been able to grant upwards of $500 million or $500,000 grants to organizations like Jesse's who want to establish community air monitoring program. So far we have about 60 projects and we funded about $15 million This summer, we have a $10 million solicitation going out. Right now, we are not in the budget next year for additional funds for our community assistance grants due to the budget crisis, but some of that is continuing to be worked out. So capacity building, training, community air monitoring, and technical assistance. I'm hoping that this year also we'll be able to grant directly to community-based organizations who can run their own processes, come up with their own, do their own public process, come up with their own strategies, negotiate their own MOUs, and come up with their own community emission reduction plans. Oops, wrong way. So finally, just a few next steps. We had the benefit of partnering with University of California at Davis, who did program evaluation for us on the first year. They came up with a number of issues that around our steering committees, but this was our public process generally, where we really need to work to bring uniformity to our steering committees. We also need to make sure that they are all provided stipends so that they are able to participate. We're working on right now, working out issues of community steering committee governance. Some of the community steering committees have co-lead models where there's a community-based organization that's partnered with the air district. They literally have the authority to put the agendas together. We have some organizations that are actually doing some of the air monitoring, like contracted with the air districts to do the air monitoring. And that's pretty cool because it's building capacity so that in some of these remote areas like Imperial County, where CARB actually does have a monitoring station at the border in Calexico, it's been hard for us to hire and keep staff there who want to come from Sacramento or LA or wherever to maintain this monitor. And so we're really excited about the prospect of these community-based organizations that are doing their own community monitoring, actually training people who might be interested in going into state service and working in some of these outposts. I mentioned stipends. Also, the air districts are grappling with whether or not they want to increase fees, permitting fees, and other types of fees to fund their work. So far, they've been hesitant, but I think that at least one district is moving into that direction. And then some of the districts have mentioned the issue of mission creep. Although at CARB, our mission does include a public health imperative, but there are some people at some of the districts who are worried about mission creep into public health. Whatever you might think about that, that topic did come up. Finally, in the future, we're moving into the implementation phase in many communities. We're also working with some communities to prepare them, doing the groundwork to prepare them, building capacity now, training on air quality, training on technology so that they are ready to hit the ground running when their communities are ultimately selected to come into the program. I mentioned the transferability of strategies. We are doing regular periodic review. Transparency is a cornerstone of that, and we actually have our advisory body and the environmental justice members of that advisory body rolling up their shirt sleeves and helping us to develop guidance documents and things like that. And then finally, our board, the Air Resources Board itself, is very involved in our work. And they are the ones who annually address whether or not we'll have new communities added. So thank you. I look forward to the questions at the end.
Thanks, everyone. I want to thank all of my prior presenters for this excellent work they've done in laying out kind of the history and a little more of the specific details about environmental justice, as well as some of its specifics around issues like climate change. I don't know about you all, but I need a break. This is this 90 minutes, 95 minutes is pretty intense. So I'm going to give listeners at least a good 30 seconds to a minute just to catch their breath. There's a lot of information. So I want folks to stand up if you need to stand up. I stood up. I had to stand up. Yeah, let's kind of stretch a little bit, maybe move around, kind of get your arms up in the air, maybe move your feet a little bit, whatever you can do to kind of get the blood circulating again, and maybe kind of catch your breath. As we prepare to wrap up, I'll try to keep my presentation brief. It shouldn't last any longer than, I don't know, 2.5 hours. I've cut it down from 3. So I'm confident that I'll be able to squeeze it in the remaining 2.5 hours. Seriously though, we've got about 14 minutes for presentation and maybe 15 minutes for questions and answers afterwards. And I'll try to somehow balance that 15 to 20 minutes to reserve questions and answer time. Just doing a little countdown for breathing. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to back up a little bit. So we've had a lot of details, and my presentation, in contrast, is much more conceptual. And so what I'm going to do is try to keep this very basic. I'm going to try to ask, what is environmental justice? Or what is environmental injustice? Why does environmental injustice exist? And what can we do about it, right? So I think that's kind of the basic thing, right? What is environmental injustice, right? Environmental justice is a shortened lifespan for, and I'm looking particularly through a lens of race, if you don't mind here. There's class that's an important part of this, but I'm going to look particularly through a lens of race as my talk is about anti-racist environmentalism. Environmental justice is shortened lifespan. It's episodes that you have to be rushed to the emergency room. It's things missed at work. It's susceptibility and catching COVID-19. It's succumbing to COVID-19 because of your pre-existing vulnerability caused by the air pollution that you live with every day. Environmental injustice is a heart attack that's premature. It's a stroke that's premature, that's triggered by exposure to particulate matter, right? Environmental injustice is waking up every morning in the shadow of a waste-producing facility with nobody to stop the pollution which you are breathing, which your children are breathing every day. What is environmental injustice? Environmental justice is the improper development of the lungs of a child who's 3 or 4 or 5 or 9 or 12 because of the air pollution that they're breathing every day. Environmental injustice is the creation of asthma, not just the triggering of asthma attacks, but it is the shaping of the lungs based on the work of California in the childhood lead study, which was the childhood air study, which looked at a longitudinal study across many years, how air pollution impacted children's health. And so what we see as environmental justice is the reality of death, disease, and illness. But what else is that? Environmental injustice is growing up or living in the shadow of a facility without benefiting from that facility, without the benefits of a high salary that the managers get, without the benefits of good dividends, which the shareholders get, without even the benefits often of decent work, right, which line employees get. Environmental justice is the lack of green spaces, is the inability just to go for a nice walk in a park nearby. Right? It's the inability to be able to drink from the water in the house that you live in where you pay for that water, and the water has lead in it because of contamination that was triggered by the city's decision or city manager's decision to save money without thinking about the consequences in Flint, Michigan. Environmental injustice is the inability to get city leaders, governmental leaders, to respond to you when you say there's something wrong with our water. Can you do something to help us about this problem? and they won't listen to your complaints and your concerns. And it requires a physician, right, to say, I've done a study and I see that children have elevated blood levels. You might want to listen. So environmental injustice is the experience that people have of inequity and inequality in the society that has a real harmful effect on their lives, on their lived experiences day to day. Right? And we can break that down into numbers. We can break it down into ozone exposure, particulate matter exposure. We can break it down into NOx exposure. We can break it down to elevated blood levels of children, where African Americans have up to 4 times the elevated blood levels of white children, where African Americans and Latinos experience 7,000 additional deaths as a result of air pollution, where we see that that Latinos who are middle class have the same level of exposure of whites who, or have a higher level of exposure of whites who are low or poor. And so we see that environmental injustice is a reflection of the systemic racism in American society. And that systemic racism in American society is not the result of somebody who has said, let us decide to harm people of color. It is the result of someone who has said, let us exploit the advantage that we have in our society so that we get the benefits of these facilities and they carry the burdens of those facilities. And it is the result of people who say, well, I didn't do anything that was intentionally racist when I decided to grant the permit. I didn't do anything intentionally racist when I decided to grant the modification for the permit. I didn't do anything intentionally racist when I decided to place the facility in this neighborhood or that neighborhood. I wasn't trying to harm the people when I decided I would create a landfill next door to them. But all of this is a reflection of people being in a position to be able to subordinate others' interests to their own. And we see that happening in a racialized way, right? So that the white community writ large has been able to subordinate the interests of indigenous people, subordinate the interests of communities of color to expand and advance their own, typically financial interests and interests in a clean environment. So that decision-making doesn't require any particular individual to have hatred for or to decide that they want to harm someone else. It's not an individual analysis like that person's a racist or that person's a racist. But what we have is a society that in housing, right, has been stratified based on race, so that racially restrictive covenants in law, racial redlining by banks, racist practices by homeowners associations and real estate agents and individual homeowners have determined where people live based on their racial identity. The fact that we talk about Black communities and Latinx communities and white communities is largely a result of the racist practices of the society that kept people from moving into communities where other people lived based on their racial identity. And that history has never gone away. In fact, if you look at the maps that show redlining throughout American history, what you'll find is that many of the environmental inequities we talk about map directly on those redlining maps. So what we see is that the past continue to bear fruit into the present today. And so if we want to recognize that as a problem, then when we think about a solution, we have to understand that you can't solve this by deciding I'm going to be a non-racist. In other words, if you say to yourself, oh, I'm not going to intentionally harm someone based on their racial identity, and I work for the EPA, or I'm not going to intentionally harm someone based on their racial identity, and I work for a local law firm, or I don't want to harm anyone based on their racial identity when I get out of law school. Wherever you find yourself today, maybe you work for EDF, maybe you work for Natural Resources Defense Council, maybe you work for Kentucky Environmental Protection Program. If you just go about your job as if the race of the people who are experiencing these environmental harms is irrelevant, you will continue to replicate the systematic discrimination that these people experience on a daily basis. You keep alive the fact that 4 times as many African American children are suffering from elevated blood levels. You keep alive the fact that African Americans and Latinos have such a disproportionate exposure to ozone and NOx and particulate matter, right? Your failure to recognize that these communities suffer as a result of historic racism and ongoing indifference, right, to the consequences of that historic racism keeps the status quo in place. So the only way to engage in an anti-racist environmentalism is to recognize, to begin with, that the board has been set in an unfair, racist manner, that white supremacy as an ideology set the board that we are now playing on today. So if you're just going to play the game and pretend that race doesn't matter, oh, that may be fine in the sense of you may feel comfortable, but that doesn't change any of these experiences of health disparities, economic disparities, and disparities in terms of the value of people's property, their mental health when they have trucks going by every day, right? Carrying waste, carrying garbage, producing odors, right? Their experiences of harm are reinforced by the indifference, right, of people in positions of power, in environmental organizations, in governmental organizations, who are unwilling to lift a finger to change their experience. And when people say, oh, I just want to enforce the environmental laws for everyone, that's the same conversation we're having about Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter, right? All lives matter can't be true until Black Lives Matter. So as long as you have a group of people who are not receiving the benefits of environmental protection, then you can't say you're protecting the environment for everyone. Because those communities who find themselves most vulnerable and most marginalized are not receiving the benefits of the environmental protection that those communities who have the least level of exposure to air pollution, the cleanest water, the greatest access to clean spaces and green spaces, and the highest level of returns on their financial investment in polluting companies and the benefits of managerial positions, right, and employment opportunities, right, and clean water to drink. There is no universal environmental protection, right? There's protection for those who have the greatest level and the cleanest environment, and then there's what other people have at the other end, right? Who may be surrounded by multiple facilities, who may be suffering synergistic and cumulative impacts as a result of multiple pollutants that they are breathing in or exposed to every day. There's those whose homes flood every time you get a significant rain and who are proximate to combined sewer overflows where human sewage spills out in their neighborhoods, right? And then there are people who live in areas where there's never flooding, and people who live in areas who don't even know what a combined sewer overflow is, who never have to worry about particulate matter dust settling on their vehicles every morning when they come out, who never have to worry about when their kids go out and play, whether or not the smokestack is emitting at that time when their children are outside playing. Right? So if you say, oh, I don't think environmental justice has any relevance for me, then you are in a position in this society of being privileged. Now you can use the privilege you have in this society to try to stop the environmental injustices or to continue to benefit from those privileges and enjoy those benefits. Enjoy the cleaner air you breathe, enjoy the safer water that you drink, enjoy the fact that your children are not exposed to lead, right? And enjoy the fact that you aren't in the shadow of a polluting facility or that a waste facility is going to locate in your neighborhood. Enjoy that, but enjoy it with the recognition that you're benefiting from the racism of the society. You're benefiting from the discrimination of the society, right? If you're not suffering, then you're benefiting. And the question is, do you want to stop the suffering of those who are not benefiting? And if you do, then you have to approach the environmental agenda and the work that you do in a different manner. You can't approach it with a status quo perspective. You have to approach it from the perspective that you recognize the problem and that you're committing to change it. Now, I'm going to make my slideshow available because there isn't time for me to go through it, but hopefully my remarks have been able to trigger some thinking for you and some perspectives that might cause you to think about your environmentalism in a way that.
Thank you, Carlton. I think we now have some time for questions. So I'm going to pull these up, and a reminder to everyone that you can enter your questions using GoTo's question box. That's at the bottom of the side panel, the control panel. Let's see. So our first question, a participant asks, I belong to a climate book club of progressive, well-meaning white people, but some of them are not at all educated on EJ. Can you recommend a good book that would be a good starting point for EJ 101?
I mentioned previously Dr. Bullard's book, Dumping in Dixie. I think that that's a good place to start. It's, I think it's available in paperback. There are a number of good books, and you can just go online and any environmental forum and find, but I'll stick with Dumping in Dixie.
I'd like to throw in, if I could, Unequal Protection by Bullard, which I think is also an excellent book.
Yes.
And I'll also throw in Resisting Global Toxics, the Transnational Movement for Environmental Justice, to get to Quentin's earlier reference about international environmental justice issues. And so it looks at environmental justice in a global perspective rather than just in the American domestic perspective.
I don't think I have anything to add. I don't think I have anything to add. Those are great books. And Dr. Bullard, of course, has millions and millions.
Thank you so much. We have another question from a participant who says, or who asks, what do the panelists believe is the connection between environmental justice, a just transition, and the abolition of the prison industrial complex?
Do we have another 2 hours? Or,
Lavinia can probably sum it up in about 2 minutes.
Wow, that's a lot of faith in me, Professor. I don't know that I can, but I think this goes back to this vision of what does Black liberation look like, and I guess I should also add in solidarity with Native and Brown communities as well. Yeah, the prison industrial complex, I think, is a vestige of the system that has also created these environmental injustices, and it's literally the antithesis of liberation and freedom. And so the two are inherently tied. I probably would have to take some more time and do, yeah, I guess more research on there. I'm sure there are like links between environment and the prison industrial complex. But I do think that as we move forward in building like the communities that we want to see, like rethinking yeah, a holistic view of what freedom looks like is necessary. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, you know, I really feel like not enough attention is paid to prisons in California. We have, you know, pre-COVID outbreaks of, for example, Valley fever virus in prisons, and to keep people incarcerated and vulnerable to highly contagious diseases is really problematic. In the COVID world, you know, I'm sure that prisons across the country can tell the same story. In California, San Quentin prison, probably our most famous prison, has about 1/3 of the inmates have COVID. And interestingly, in California, we use our prison labor to fight wildfires. So all of these terrible wildfires across the state are being fought by prisoners on the front line. We actually sent a number of prisoners to another prison to get wildfire training, and they infected those prisons. So I would really love to see more thought given around environmental justice and what people are facing in prison. I don't think there's enough there.
Thank you. We have a question specifically for Professor Pear. What would you choose as an effective tool for environmental scientists who would like to see more effective enforcement of current environmental regulations for vulnerable populations?
Nothing like an easy question. Really, it's getting in finding avenues to get involved with policy making. And there are things like the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, to their positions that open up every year, and committees, subcommittees at the state level. You can find you need to become involved with entities that have some impact on regulatory and policy making. There was a study that was done. I understand there's an update going on about there's a 50-state study on environmental justice. The last edition, I think, is 2010. But there's an update that's coming that gives you an idea at the local level and the state level entities that are involved with environmental justice. It's a good starting place for local. That would be my advice, is to get it involved. Yes.
Thank you, Quentin.
Could I add?
Oh, of course.
Sorry. Okay. Maybe two things that I think might be useful. One is the use of community science or citizen science. So there are a lot of cost-effective methods for that environmental scientists can use to kind of do projects in your own neighborhood to get a sense of what air pollution looks like or what water pollution looks like. I think it's a really effective tool just in terms of getting a sense of as far as enforcement goes. I think there's a lot of work being done on integrating community science into enforcement. Another is the use of maps like EJ Screen and Cal EnviroScreen. I think they lay out pretty well, like provide data in terms of what environmental injustice looks like. That's pretty hard to argue with. And I think those can be tools to kind of help visualize where environmental injustice is concentrated.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one more question. So how have environmental rights seen in states like Pennsylvania impacted the ability to advance the environmental justice movement? So I think this is about Pennsylvania having environmental rights as part of their state constitution. If anyone wants to speak on this a little bit more.
I guess I would just throw in that a right without a remedy doesn't really change the lived experience of the people that have it. So I think the key to that is whether or not those rights mean that, and I don't know that that's the case, that people suffering environmental injustice now have a remedy for it.
Thank you so much. So I'm sorry to be ending this. This is you know, such an amazing part of summer school and really one of our most favorite programs of the year. So I do want to thank our participants for joining us today and for your thoughtful questions. We do hope that you'll continue to think about the vital importance of environmental justice. We're so grateful for your participation in ELI's annual summer school series, and we hope to welcome you to future programs later this month and in the fall. I want to extend the biggest thank you to our fantastic panel, Veronica, Quentin, Lavinia, Robin, and Carlton. You all have contributed so much to summer school, to this field. Thank you for lending your expertise today and always. Appreciate it, and I hope you all have a nice afternoon.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you.